And on behalf of St. Raymond's and St. Mary's, I welcome you back to the Catholic Faith Explained. Let us begin with a prayer. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit, amen. Father, as we consider some of the history and culture in Scotland and England, we pray for unity in your church. We pray also for the courage to be good witnesses to our faith. We ask the intercession of so many martyrs and confessors that our Catholic faith may remain strong and that we will grow together in love. We ask this through Christ our Lord. Amen. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. I'm going to warn you in advance, this talk is going to be well over an hour. I don't see any way around that. If you need to leave, please feel free to do so, and I won't be offended in the least, as long as you're not offended at me going over the promised time. There's just too many fun and interesting things to share here. The same summer of 2009, as you recall, I spent July in Paris that I shared last time. So many blessed experiences during that special month, and it was actually within that month that I had my excursion in London. I pondered how to do this. I knew I was going to be in Scotland for the month of August, and I figured, well, I'll drive down to London at some point and see that. But I realized, that's actually going to be an 8-hour drive each way, and I do have pastoral duties there that I'll be expected to do. And it's only 2.5 hours to go from Paris to London by train, through the channel, under the ocean. How often do you get to do that? So I took the channel under the ocean. I spent a weekend in London, and really a delightful weekend. I'll just be able to share some highlights from. So there you go, kids, Big Ben, Parliament, and not going to dwell on a lot of these. Some of them are just sites that everybody has to see in London. It was, though, very refreshing to have those couple of days after some of the experiences I described last month of being so overwhelmed with the immersion in the French language and culture, and having days where it was simply challenging and difficult to have a couple of days in a city with a fairly familiar language, spoken a little differently, was very refreshing. And I took a picture of the famous, one of the guards at Buckingham Palace, and I didn't bother to stay around and watch the changing of the guard. I had too many things I wanted to see, and I didn't do any of the little cute things you might see in movies where people go up and try to provoke the guard. They don't show you in the movies that there's another guard standing by that kind of discourages you doing that, so I didn't bother to do that. I did really enjoy St. James Park, or St. James Gardens. They have these lovely gardens in the city there. This one was my favorite by far. Beautiful fountains and ponds and wildlife, flora and fauna. Very relaxing to walk through. Interesting to ponder too. This was my friend Luke shared this with me. He's a priest now in Texas. He was a seminarian at the time, studying French as well in Paris, and came to visit me for a couple days up in Scotland. And he made this observation comparing the gardens in France, the gardens in England, and it gives you all kinds of interesting reflections on the cultures. By the way, the title of Dickens' book, A Tale of Two Cities, is about Paris and London. And you see on the left a garden. I think that's the Luxembourg Gardens in Paris. Very orderly, very tidy. Every last detail arranged by the gardeners and put in proper order. You see the British Garden, also orderly, but it's more of a contained chaos, or a contained, nature doing its own thing, with plants and animals allowed to have their way, so to speak, within a well-ordered society. You could extend that reflection and say all kinds of things if you wanted to about law or politics. I don't have enough expertise to do that. Generally speaking, both of us really enjoyed the British Gardens and found them more fun to walk through, although we liked both very much. But then I was thinking about when it comes to philosophy and theology, I mentioned last time how much I love reading authors, French authors. in those two subjects, when it comes to the mind, you do want things to make neat distinctions and see things with clarity and have good order in your thought. So there's something to be said for the French Garden in that capacity. I'll move on. These are geese, not ducks. There are no ducks in this talk, I will have you know, just in case you were wondering. I'm not going to dwell on this, but it's an amazing place, the British Museum. If you're ever in London, it's a must-see. There are so many pieces, and there, of course, the Rosetta Stone, you've all heard of, very famous, but Egyptian pieces and Assyrian pieces, and much of the Parthenon from Athens is there. It's kind of amusing. I mean, maybe some would say questionable how the British Museum has all these great treasures from all over the world, which they are safekeeping to make sure that they're kept for generations to come. Some might call that rather imperialistic, but at the same time, they are doing a great job of safekeeping them. They might otherwise have been lost, and it's a free museum. I mean, so by all means, if you're in London, be sure to check it out. But again, I will move on to some things that I especially want to cover this evening. I also was able to see that Saturday performance of Hamlet. I really wanted to see Shakespeare performed live in London. That was definitely on the list. I went to, I believe it was Trafalgar Square. They were supposed to be these places that sold discounted tickets. I was reading in the tour book, and then I discovered it was discounted tickets, but not for Shakespeare. But then I walked up to this theater, and I learned every day at 10 a.m. they sell 33 tickets for the show. That evening was sold out. The matinee was sold out, but had standing room. So I thought, okay, 10 pounds, sure. Standing room, you might not realize it's not as bad as it sounds. It's just behind the back row. Behind each seat, there's a spot for standing room. And you stand and watch the show. But then the usher invited me and said, you know, there's some no-shows, so go ahead and take that seat. So for 10 British pounds, got to see Jude Law performing Hamlet live. It was amazing. Moved me to tears. It's my favorite Shakespeare play by far. Really delves into the human mind, human psychology, human relationships, and struggles, and always moves me to tears. I saw it performed again this summer at our own Spring Green here in Wisconsin. Great play, but very special to see it in Shakespeare's own London. But I think the highlight of that whole weekend in London, I've always been one for treasure hunts. Even as a little kid, my sister and I used to get all excited to make treasure hunts or to go on them. And now I've done some for my nieces and nephews, and they get all excited for that. But real life ones are fun too, where you want to find something, you don't know exactly where it is, and you just kind of set out and do your best to find it, and the satisfaction of getting there. So there were 4 such treasure hunts this weekend, where I got information off the internet, but I was still doing a lot of work on the ground. The first 2 I'll explain in a moment, the Scaffold and the Tyburn Tree, both very important sites for us Catholics studying the history of England. And then the other 2 would make more sense to you immediately, C.S. Lewis and J.R.R. Tolkien, 2 great authors, wanting to go to their graves and pay respects. 2 authors that have had a big influence on my own life and thought. So those are 4 quests for treasure hunts that weekend. First, the Scaffold. I knew that it was somewhere on Tower Hill, not too far from the tube stop. They call the subway the tube, or the underground there. And nearby is also the famous Tower Bridge, I'm sure you've all seen pictures of. But it was not so easy to find the Scaffold. I could find just limited information on the internet, and I wasn't seeing any signs. I figured there might be some signpost marking it, but they didn't want to show where it was. For those of you who don't know, St. John Fisher, the Bishop of Rochester, martyred in 1535, and St. Thomas More, one-time Chancellor of England, also martyred in 1535, both at the scaffold. They were beheaded after being tried for treason under King Henry VIII. More on that in a moment. It's interesting, the 2 titles that King Henry VIII has. One was given to him in 1521. This was before the whole saga with his many divorces and other issues with women. But Martin Luther posted his 95 Theses on the church at the cathedral in Wittenberg, and King Henry VIII had written a book in response called In Defense of the Seven Sacraments. Some speculate maybe with help from St. Thomas More, but regardless, he published this book. Pope Leo X was so pleased, he gave him the title Fidei Defensor, Defender of the Faith. And it's a title that he kept throughout his life, as we will see. The other title was one he wanted for himself, and which was conferred on him by Parliament in 1534, declaring him Supreme Head of the Church in England, which is especially where the controversy ensued. As you may know, St. Thomas More already was not willing to support him in his efforts to secure a divorce and remarry, to put away his wife, Catherine, and marry Anne Boleyn, and putting pressure on the Pope, putting pressure on the Catholic Church in England to get his way with that, and Thomas More not wanting to cooperate as Chancellor. But then when Henry declared himself Supreme Head of the Church in England and Parliament passed that act, John Fisher was the only bishop in England, the only Catholic bishop who refused to sign. All the others caved in and said, yes, you are the head of the church in England. One bishop had the courage to say no and was beheaded for it. And St. Thomas More resigned as chancellor, but that wasn't enough, eventually putting him on trial and getting somebody to perjure himself in order to convict him. By the way, I hope when I get to heaven, I'm sure any of you who have seen that movie, A Man for All Seasons, classic movie, that St. Thomas More actually does look and speak like Paul Scofield. I'd be disappointed if it was any other way. There's also a Charlton Heston version, which is worth seeing, but the Paul Scofield version, Oscar-winning movie about the trial and death of St. Thomas More, if you haven't seen it, it's a must-see. So these titles with Henry, it's interesting, they're still there. I don't think a lot of people realize this today. To this day, Queen Elizabeth II, officially, even though there's not a big deal made out of this title, she is considered the supreme head of the church in England, of the Anglican Church. The Archbishop of Canterbury, practically speaking, plays a more prominent role, but she is the figurehead. Still, this is part of the complication. If you are wondering who might be the next monarch of England, and if there's a Catholic involved, it can't be the monarch of England because of this connection of being supreme head of the church. Also the title Fidei Defensor, Defender of the Faith, still there. Look at their money, FD right here. This is what that means on the coinage in Britain, Defender of the Faith, a title given by the Pope, still claimed by the kings and queens of England over the centuries. Really just interesting history that still endures to this day. So I went to see the Tower of London as well while looking for the scaffold. That is where Thomas More was kept prisoner. I didn't realize this, I was expecting a tower, but it's actually a fortress that has towers in it and a museum. But within that, it was very moving for me to go into the cell where Thomas More spent those years and look out the window of that cell, ponder what it was like for him to be imprisoned there because he refused to violate his conscience and he held fast to his convictions of conscience, not even speaking out boldly about it, simply refusing to cooperate with evil, and for it was imprisoned and ultimately beheaded for the faith. Powerful to think about back then, and this is almost 5 years ago now, in light of more recent developments and the growing threats to religious liberty in our own country. We Catholic priests now and then think about those kind of things with the future and pray for God to guide us, and if it ever comes to that, to remain strong in our conscience and live and die with a clear conscience. Much to think about and pray about. I did eventually find it. I was just about ready to give up my search. It's kind of nestled within a park and next to a monument in honor of the merchant fleet and the sailors of Britain that gave their lives during the first two world wars. And that's a nice monument to have. That one was well marked out, but they didn't mark out where the scaffold was. Once you get right on top of it, it is a very nice little monument, but hard to find. I did find it, and here's the inscription, which does do it justice. to commemorate the tragic history, and in many cases, the martyrdom of those who, for the sake of their faith, country, or ideals, staked their lives and lost. On this site, more than 125 were put to death, the names of some of whom are recorded here, including the John Fisher, Bishop of Rochester, Sir Thomas More, and several others. Interesting, on the other plaque, some less reputable names like Thomas Cromwell, who was Henry VIII's right-hand man in getting business done, but then Henry turned on him too. And 5 years later in 1540, Thomas Howard, another character from the movie A Man for All Seasons, those of you who have seen it. So that was great to find that, to pray there, a prayerful experience, as well as the other site I wanted to find, the Tyburn Tree, which is near Hyde Park, famous park in London, and the site of many Catholic martyrs. This is where Queen Elizabeth and several others put to death felons, public execution of felons, including many Catholic priests who dared to commit the felony of celebrating Catholic sacraments in England, and tortured and killed in very savage ways at this site. So definitely a site worth visiting and pondering. The most, this chapel nearby I found first, and it had adoration, and I prayed there, holy hour both that day and the next day. It was nice to have a site to pray there near this site of martyrdom. As it points out, this little plaque, 105 Catholic martyrs lost their lives over the course of those 150 years on that site. And it really was like a treasure hunt. Inside the chapel there was a cryptic sign that said, 300 paces due east of here lies the Tyburn Tree. And I had to pace it out and try to find it, and eventually did. The most famous martyr at this site, probably St. Edmund Campion. If you don't know much about him, you might read a biography of him by Hilaire Belloc. It's probably one of the better biographies of him. Very good, entertaining read, inspiring read. And he was executed under Queen Elizabeth. He could have easily been Archbishop of Canterbury, as Belloc points out, if he had remained on the popular path and just become a cleric of the Church of England. Could have had a very easy, comfortable, prestigious life, but remained true to his Catholic faith, entered the Society of Jesus and was ordained as a Jesuit priest, was captured, tried, found guilty of treason and executed. And I'm not sure if treason was the charge, I can't remember, don't quote me on that. But drawn and quartered like so many of the priests were during this era, and those who harbored priests. And drawing and quartering might sound kind of quaint, like they have a sketch artist who does a nice little sketch of the person, and then everybody pulls out their pocket change and starts throwing quarters at the person, but that's not what it is. I'll try to be as non-graphic as possible, but it's not a likable thing to describe. They were hung, but to quote the Princess Bride, hung until they were mostly dead, at which point their entrails and genitalia were removed and burned before them, and then each of their appendages tied to a horse, sent to the four winds. That's the quartering part. But before that, removing the head and putting that on a pike, so to display, to show everybody not to commit these terrible felonies. Again, not very pleasant. Thank goodness that Queen Elizabeth, good Queen Bess, was not like Mary the First, Bloody Mary, right? I mean, good thing that she wasn't so savage and cruel. It was just an ugly time. We've been over this in these talks before. This century was not a good century for respecting conscience, respecting religious freedom, respecting human dignity. It was a problem all around, but definitely a problem for the Catholics in England, who were severely persecuted at the time. Many Catholic homes had priest holes in them. Contrary to popular belief, the Catholic faith in England was popular. There were abuses. There were priests and bishops who were not doing what they were supposed to do. You should read the writings of Thomas More when he talks about the bishops. He compares them to the apostles falling asleep on Jesus in the garden. But not very kind words that he has for the bishops of his day, and yet he respected them and honored them, and it was not like some authors used to portray a couple hundred years ago of this myth of the Catholics being so overjoyed to be set free from their medieval superstitious faith and embrace the wonders of modern Protestantism and how they were set free. No, they were forced to do so by the government against their will. And many of them continued to practice their Catholic faith in secret, to house priests in secret, and of course many others, for various reasons, either promises of bribes or threats and blackmail, turned over priests, turned over those who were housing priests. And the ingenious priest holes were ways of using the house and the contours of the house to have secret hiding places for the priests. I remember hearing one story from a friend who visited a pub in England called the Priest Hole, and it has an old priest hole in it and a plaque telling the story about how someone had tipped off law enforcement that a priest was hiding there behind the fireplace, but he couldn't find the secret hiding place, and that nobody was going to say anything in the house. So he just kept stoking the fire hotter and hotter, hoping the priest would cry out in pain. The priest was in pain and did give his life, but knew that if he cried out, that he would be betraying the people who were housing him, and they too would be in trouble. And so he silently died a martyr. There was an especially famous saint, famous at the time for making the most clever priest holes. He made many of them that were never found during the time of persecution, many successfully hidden priests. He was a Jesuit brother himself. He was eventually betrayed, turned over, and put in the Tower of London and tortured because he had much information. I mean, he knew these homes, he knew the people, he knew the priests, and he didn't give away a single thing. And he died under torture in the Tower of London as a very heroic saint. So many interesting stories from this time period, not a pleasant time period. On a related note, I was able to explore when I was in Rome, the Venerable English College. In Europe, colleges are places where you live. They're not schools. You go to the university, you live at a college, and in Rome there are all these different colleges. The North American College, where the American seminarians live. The English College was especially prominent during this time of persecution and earned the title Venerable because of this. Here you see their motto, Ignam veni mittere in terram, Jesus' words, I have come to cast fire upon the earth. Powerful words for a seminary training men to go back home and quite possibly be tortured and martyred for their faith as priests, and knowing that's what they're training for. And seeing that coat of arms every day. Here's a list of the many martyrs that were graduates of the English College over those decades and gave their life for the faith. And the inscription, precious in the sight of the Lord is the death of his saints. There was also the seminary in Douai across the channel in modern-day France, I believe. Maybe I'm wrong. And I know a priest who went there as well in modern-day times. The seminary there, in the chapel, I chose not to put these images in. I try to keep it as family-friendly as I can. But all around the top of the chapel, very graphic paintings of these English martyrdoms, which were not pleasant. And this is what the seminarians get to look at, thinking about what they're preparing for. I think those were put in after the persecution was over as a remembrance, never forgetting what happened. Every time another martyrdom happened, every time they heard tell of what was happening in England, and that another of their companions who was newly ordained had been martyred for the faith, they sang the Te Deum, which is a song of praise to God that is normally sung at the ordination of a bishop or during the Liturgy of the Hours for solemn feast days. And they always sang praise to God every time another one of them witnessed as a martyr. Powerful time, and hard to imagine what it would be like to be training under those circumstances. I had a little glimpse of that. I had a few classmates in my own seminary in Ohio who were from Burma, which was under a very oppressive military dictatorship at the time. And we all knew that it was quite possible that things could get worse, and they could be tortured or killed for the faith. And they were up for it, and very joyful going back home. Amazing to see. So 300 paces due east, and I did find it eventually. It took some time. I was struggling to find it. It's on a little traffic island in the middle of an intersection. There's kind of a triangular traffic island, and it's just at ground level. But I found the site, which is marked, and prayed a decade of the rosary there. Asked so many of these martyrs, both priests and those who housed priests and those who dared to practice their faith in secret, to pray for me, for us. And a little comic relief, all this heavy stuff. So this was a sign nearby that lightened the mood a little bit. If you ever are caught in Westminster, you can get out your phone and get very valuable information. So the third treasure hunt, C.S. Lewis, that great English author, apologist for the Christian faith. I took a bus to Oxford Sunday morning and went out and bought a map at a local gas station and started making my way and figuring. I knew roughly where I was, and I was able to find it and find the path here to Trinity Church where he attended. And I was going to go explore the church a little bit too, but they were actually singing the Gloria inside, so I left them alone and just went to the churchyard and quietly paid my respects at his grave, thinking of the many books of his that were so influential on me during my college years. And it's a reminder to me now, I haven't read his books for a long time. I should go back and reread a couple of those. Great author, if you haven't read them. And more than just children's books. I mean, the Narnia books are great, but he wrote so many other books helping explain and defend Christianity in light of modern culture. I made my way on by the local bus and explored a little bit Oxford University, took a picture here of Magdalen College where C.S. Lewis lived at Oxford and where he wrote so many of his works. And took a little time to figure out, but navigated the local buses to find the cemetery that nearby where Tolkien is buried. His grave was well marked, easy to find, gets quite obviously a lot more attention than C.S. Lewis's grave does. And there's a lot of nerds in the world who are big fans and make their pilgrimage, all kinds of little keepsakes that, you get the sense that it's cleaned off on a regular basis and people just keep dumping more stuff at his grave. But it was also great to visit his tomb. I especially enjoy reading his letters. They're very interesting. His Catholic faith really shines through. It shines through in his fiction as well, but very clearly in his letters. Very devout Catholic who loved the Eucharist, who loved to pray before the Blessed Sacrament, who loved daily Mass, strong Catholic faith. So those were 4 little treasure hunts. It was a fun weekend. I then made my way back into the city, back to the train station, back through the Channel, back to Paris, back to class. Finished out that month in Paris. But before I left, I had to stop at this site, which some of you will know well, the Eagle and Child, a pub there near Oxford that C.S. Lewis and Tolkien and this other group of scholars regularly hung out at and had kind of an informal group that criticized each other's works and had discussions of all sorts that really fueled the imagination and creativity of their work. And Tolkien is often credited for Lewis becoming a devout Christian. Lewis kind of journeyed from being atheistic to agnostic to very devout Christian, great defender of Christian faith. And it was really, from what I understand, a discussion of mythology. Lewis, like so many other very intelligent scholars, said, that Christianity stuff, that's just a clever myth, a cleverly concocted myth, as Scripture talks about. But Tolkien's response was, of course it's a myth. It's the only myth that's true. In other words, all these other myths stir up something in the human heart that we're made for, this sense of longing for fulfillment, but don't quite satisfy. But Christianity actually happened. Those saving events of Jesus' life, death, and resurrection really happened. They are the one myth that is true and that fulfills all these yearnings. And once Lewis understood how mythology is properly understood, everything clicked and fell into place and became such a great writer for the faith. So it was fun to have lunch there and ponder what it must have been like for these great authors to get together on a regular basis. My last night in Paris there was at the end of July. I went up the hill to Sacred Heart Church one last time, made another holy hour at their perpetual adoration. Such a wonderful place of prayer overlooking the whole city, and such a statement of faith in contrast to all the false gods to the political left or right, and what really matters in this life. But for me, looking over this city with profound gratitude for the month I had had and eager for the month to come, getting up very early and making my way to the Scottish borders. It was a rugged journey. I always was trying to be frugal in my travels. In this summer in particular, obviously quite a lot of traveling, and you burn through money rather quickly, even trying to be frugal and wanting to do that. So I tried never to take taxis if I could help it, but you got packing in June for Paris and a month in Paris, studying French, for Scotland and a month in Scotland with its climate, and then a whole year in Rome. And knowing that Rome doesn't have all the conveniences of America, trying to plan for all of that. Thankfully, at the time, you could have 2 checked bags on the international flight. So there I was with a 50-pound backpack, with a 50-pound checked bag, which was humongous because my other one had broken when I arrived at Paris, and I had to go on eBay France and order a new one, and it was bigger than I expected. But 50 pounds in there, and then of course the carry-on wheelie bag, you put about 70 or 80 pounds in that so that you can stay underweight on the other. You load all your books into there, and then your laptop case, you shove 5-6 books into there, and that's how you get it all packed. Because I was studying for a doctorate too, so I had books. So lugging all that through the public transit system to get to the airport, to get to Scotland, and then I come to the subway, and there's a turnstile, and it's about 18 inches wide, walls on either side. How on earth am I going to do this? Well, I did it. Somehow I activated the turnstile and got all 4 of my bags and myself through, much to the wonderment of the Parisians watching me. Maybe they were scared, I don't know. I'm sure it was a sight to behold, but somehow I did it. And eventually arrived safely that night into Edinburgh and then into the Scottish borders. Kind of I suppose you could say ironic, in Edinburgh at the airport. I was briefly detained by UK immigration. Not the first time, by the way. I was once detained by US immigration. I was helping a Peruvian boy go home to visit his parents and then come back to the US for medical help. And the family hosting him here chose not to tell me that his visa was not the right kind of visa. And we were sitting for an hour in a US immigration until I worked that one out, but I did. But this time, I did have a visa from the Archdiocese of St. Andrews in Edinburgh to spend a month, not for pay, as a priest, just getting a food allowance. Thankfully, I had just received that email. The pastor was a bit of a procrastinator. I didn't know that I would need it, but I was able to have that information. But the irony, I suppose you could say, from what we might expect by stereotypes, you have the immigration security guard in her burqa, clearly very devout Muslim woman, having the very Caucasian white guy sit down and make sure that he could be cleared to come into this country. So, but it all worked out, and we had a very pleasant exchange, and off I went into Scotland. And the borders are about here. Scotland, as I learned, is shaped like Santa Claus, or as they say there, Father Christmas. You have his cap up here, and his beard, and his bag of toys, and his feet. So down in the bottom there by his feet, that's where I was, the border with England. Very troubled history there too, as we will learn. I really enjoyed the scenery. Driving there, I was given a car of one of the parishioners to use for the 3 parishes. And as I drove around, I thought, this looks a lot like my own diocese. If you drive from here to La Crosse and look at the scenery there around Arcadia, very similar, just if you change the cows and make them sheep, and if you change more of the corn and make all of it into hay, and then you throw in some medieval castles here and there, then you've got, that's what it looks like. So, very similar. And as I learned, population 102,000, but 1.4 million sheep in the Scottish borders. They were everywhere, and very beautiful to look at, the scenery with all those sheep all over the place. Another claim to fame for the borders, Sir Walter Scott, I'm sure some of you have heard of, famous Scottish author. He wrote Ivanhoe or Rob Roy or The Talisman, many works. This was his home I visited in Abbotsford, not the first city in Wisconsin, but the Abbotsford in Scotland. Very eclectic collection of all kinds of little trinkets, both ancient and modern, in his house. It was an interesting tour. Interesting guy, and I've read his fiction since then, and very interesting fiction as well. This is one of my favorite spots in the borders. It was his as well. It's called Scott's View. It was kind of funny because this seminarian was visiting. He was in the passenger seat, which of course is on the left side. I was on the right side. And as we were driving, he said, "Oh, there's a really great view coming up here." And it turns out it was Scott's view. Sir Walter Scott thought the same thing as well. So much did he like it that when his funeral procession was passing by, they stopped so he could have one last look at his favorite vista of the Scottish borders. So for a month I was assisting at 3 small parishes there while the pastor was away on holiday, as they say. Canon law allows us priests to have 4 weeks of vacation a year. Here in the United States, we try to figure out how we can possibly sneak away for a few days here, a few days there, and try to take that vacation. There, they just take a month and they go. In most of Europe, it's a whole different way to parish life. So I was residing at Immaculate Conception, not in Jedburgh, but it's pronounced Jedburgh, as I learned. And you see, way back when, in the Middle Ages, this beautiful abbey that was there for many centuries, now lying in ruins, and now a very simple, austere little Catholic parish church. The church in Scotland, for reasons that we'll learn, is financially impoverished for the last few hundred years. Just barely scrapes by financially, very simple structures. We'll learn why. The other parish there, St. Mary's in Kelso, also had a ruined abbey that was nearby, and then smaller parish church. That church, I remember, did have a very beautiful chalice in it that was donated after World War II by Polish soldiers. They spent the latter part of the war. Many of them left occupied Poland to Britain to join the war efforts and resist the Nazis in whatever way they could. And some of those soldiers were there, went to Mass every week. We're so grateful at the end they donated a chalice to the parish that I got to use. And then the third parish, St. Mary's and St. David's it's pronounced Hoik. I'm sure you guessed that. Hoik. That's just how it looks. And I think there's a saying there that strange as Hoik folk, something like that. They have an accent that is totally unique. Not hard to understand. I could understand what they were saying, but not Scottish, really. Sort of English, but not really. There's nothing else like it. And all the people around know that as well. Immediately can recognize that someone is from Hoik. Of course, I had an accent that was quite obvious to all the people listening to me preach every week. I did try to speak more slowly, not to speak quickly, in case there were words that I pronounced so differently that they wouldn't understand. They generally understood me, though, because of so many American movies and television shows and such. They were able to follow what I was saying. Delightful month at those 3 parishes. There was some culture shock, nowhere near like it is in Italy or other places, but things to adjust to. Different currency, so now I had gotten used to going from dollars to euro and calculating in my mind how many euros equals how many dollars. Now I had to do the same with the Great British Pound. There was one day I remember looking at my desk, and here I got dollars here, and I've got euro here, and I've got pounds here, and German books here, and French books here, and I'm thinking, what am I, a spy? One of the most baffling things was the first time I stepped on the scale in the bathroom at the rectory. And I said, what the heck? I had eventually gotten used to kilograms in Rome. Okay, 1 pound is 2.2 kilograms. I can do the math and figure out how much I weigh when I step on the scale there. But how many pounds are in a stone? I learned it was in stones. I learned now a stone is 14 pounds. I now know. I'm not going to tell you how many stones I weighed because you might do the math and figure that out. But the supermarket, nothing as challenging as Italy, certainly, but different. I never quite got used to the carts. I worked in a grocery store for a couple years, and I think that's why I was so used to doing stunts with the carts in the grocery store that I worked in. They have swivels on all the wheels, so they handle quite differently. And unlike Italy, there is a variety of options in the UK. You don't have just one option to pick from if you want to buy something. Not quite like here where there's 500 options in one section, but enough. And when you don't know any of the brand names, it gets intimidating at times to try to puzzle over all of these and figure out which one of these should I buy. I did not buy the ox liver, chopped ox liver. Oh, that's interesting. I'll leave that on the shelf. Interesting to know that many of you know this, but if you travel anywhere else really, almost every other country, the eggs are just sitting out unrefrigerated in the grocery store. We're the only one that seems to think you have to refrigerate them. Interesting to know. We refrigerate a lot more things than other parts of the world do, for better or for worse. I had to laugh at the Garden Fete, great event at St. Mary's in Kelso. They said, oh, Father, you've got to come. Next weekend is our Garden Fete. Much like a parish picnic here, not quite as grand of a scale, but very festive. And the raffle tickets. The raffle was sort of halfway between a silent auction here and a raffle here. It was all smaller items like you'd have in a silent auction. But you just bought so many raffle tickets and they just went through one item at a time and they pulled out a winner. And I was just saying, please don't be me. Please don't be me. Because they're raffling off bubble bath and body lotion. Please don't be me. And it wasn't, thankfully. But I had to laugh. Then they pulled out a bottle of scotch, which they don't call scotch. They call whiskey. W-H-I-S-K-Y. Whiskey is Scotch whiskey. And they pull out the winner, and it's a 10-year-old. Okay, here you go. Wow. That would not meet our safe environment standards back at home. Different culture, different place. That was the Garden Fete. Of course, the haggis, I did have to try. Wikipedia tells us about haggis if you don't know what it is. Haggis is a dish containing sheep's pluck, heart, liver, and lungs, minced with onion, oatmeal, suet, spices, and salt, mixed with stock, and traditionally boiled in the animal's stomach for approximately 3 hours. And then all chopped up and some good gravy on it. It was delicious. I loved it. I really did enjoy it. I had it at a restaurant in Edinburgh. I went back and had it again the next week when I was there because it was just that good. Sometimes it's really good to branch out and try new things. I think it's the spices that made it, but I really did enjoy it. The weather was interesting, very interesting. Not what we're used to. Those of you who know me know that I'm not really big on wearing a jacket. In my old age, I wear it more. When I was a baby priest teaching high school, I barely ever wore it. I used to say jackets are for January. And I just kind of kept it on the seat in my car in case I had problems, but barely ever put it on. But there I was in Jedburgh wearing a jacket in the rectory in August, mind you, as I'm studying my German, because it was a high of 55 some of those days and very damp. So not always the warmest weather. I loved it. It was fine. The people were apologizing, but it was great. But I was so amazed at how quickly it could change. I mean, in one sense, it changes quite dramatically here. We've had 60-degree temperature shifts here the last few weeks. But from sun to rain to sun, just astounding. I remember one afternoon in a 3-hour span, I think more than 10 times going from rain to completely blue skies to rain to completely blue sky, back and forth. So quickly, I couldn't believe it. And one time, I don't know how this was possible, but I saw clear skies and I said, I'm going for a walk. It looks really nice out there. Before it rains again, I'm going to get out there. And it rained for 5 minutes with a blue sky. I don't know that that's possible, but I experienced it, so it must be possible, unless it was miraculous. The weather was very strange. So you might be familiar with this quote from Hilaire Belloc, the great Catholic author, English Catholic author of the 20th century. Wherever the Catholic sun doth shine, there's always laughter and good red wine. At least I've always found it so. Benedicamus Domino, which means let us bless the Lord. I love that quote. It's a great quote. So that came to mind that one day, and I came up with my own version of it. Wherever the Scottish sun doth shine, there's bound to be rain not far behind. At least I've always found it so. Benedicamus Domino. It was true. And I blessed the Lord for it. It was all good. As we'll see, the rain was a great blessing. I'll point out why. I just remember the people coming up to me. They were so polite, so welcoming, apologizing profusely. Oh, you have to be here in these rural parishes. We're so sorry, Too bad you can't be in Edinburgh or Glasgow. But I said rural. I mean, Hawick has 15,000 people and a lot of traffic. That in our diocese, that's not rural. That's one of the big cities. Eau Claire is the biggest city in our diocese, and it's not that big. But so they looked at themselves as very rural. I felt right at home. I loved it. I remember the pastor, how shocked he was, not in a bad way, but he had never actually met a real-life deer hunter before. He had heard tell of these Americans who own guns and go out and shoot animals, because guns are very restricted in the UK, and it's reversed in much of Europe, where hunting is very much an upper-class sport. Here, it's almost lower middle class or middle class sport. It's totally different. But he said, you've hunted yourself? Do you own a gun? Oh, yeah, my dad gave me a few. Really? So, and then he told the people about it. Watch out, he owns guns back in the United States. Well, he thought it was great. He was not against it like some people would have been in the UK, but he had never met one before. So, people the first week, I remember coming up and thanking me so much for bringing the hot weather with me, because it was 75 degrees and sunny for a few days. That was what they consider hot August weather, and we're really enjoying it. Because as they pointed out to me, normally this is what you get in Scotland. 6 months of winter, 6 months of bad weather. Yep. I believe Mark Twain said something similar about New England, 6 months of winter and 6 months of bad sledding. But anyway, the rain was not so bad. It was really the perfect setup, because I was satisfied enough with my level of French. I was able to read French as I knew I needed to. My thesis director, the one I knew I was going to pick as my thesis director, and we were starting to talk about topics, and he said, if you do that topic, you have to learn German. And I thought, oh, no. I had always joked about how German is not so much a language, it's more of a disease of the throat. But as it turns out, we'll talk more about that at the next talk, but I really grew to love the German language as I studied it. Never quite mastered it as much as French, but enjoyed learning it. But I started studying it in Scotland, again, using Rosetta Stone, the third time around. I had used it for Italian, I had used it for French, and now I use it for German. And as I came to realize, all the same pictures, all the same dialogues, all the same sentences, which wasn't such a bad thing, and it helped me get a good start before heading to Austria in September to live in an abbey for a few weeks and study it more. So, as I said, perfect setup, because when it rained, and it rained a lot, I studied German. I sat in the rectory and lit the fireplace and studied German. And then if I saw the sun come out, or if I saw it was going to be an especially nice day, I hopped in the car and went out and saw things, or I got up and went out for a walk, and it was the best of both worlds. I went for a walk almost every day, because the sun did come out at some point every day, and this is one of my favorite spots in Jedburgh, this peaceful little stream and bridge. I always enjoyed walking past that every day. Very pleasant month. Edinburgh was, I don't know, not as spectacular as some people might think, but definitely some great interesting things to see. It was a very interesting month to be there. Every August, they have a great festival. They bring in especially jazz artists from all over the world, but I think it's the biggest art festival of the arts in the world annually in August. And we'll see something else that I got to see there in August. That month, as it happens, was also world news, because you may recall this 4.5 years ago, Scottish Parliament, you see the building here of Scottish Parliament. They are part of the United Kingdom, but they have their own parliament still. And that is when they authorized the release of the Lockerbie bomber. So that was quite a controversy. And I was there during that time. In fact, my priest friend from Scotland, whose name is Scott, he's a Scot named Scott, he said, "Oh, there she goes." And he was pointing to the Attorney General, who was the major player in that whole case. So it was really interesting to be there for that. This seminarian and I walked around the city. Much of it we weren't that impressed with, but we really loved this park. It was a very pleasant stroll through that. And we were a little not impressed with this. It's a World Heritage Site called Calton Hill, and it has all these monuments emulating Athens up on top, the Parthenon and such in Athens. And it just seemed out of place to me, but a lot of people visited. We were looking for that, and that's when I just happened to stumble upon a cemetery, and all of a sudden I'm like, oh, that's David Hume's tomb. And as I've said a couple of times last year, I resisted the urge to spit, and I said a prayer, and he was a really interesting man, charming guy. According to my priest friend, he didn't take his philosophy so seriously. He raised good questions. He questioned, how can you get an ought from an is? We look at nature and what is, and somehow we reason our way to how things ought to be, and morality. How can you start with nature and get your way to ethics? He was asking the question. He's misquoted today a lot by people who say, Hume proved to us that you can't get an ought from an is, which he never said. He spends his entire third chapter of his treatise on human nature trying to do so, because he did want ethical standards. But intentionally or not, he totally paved the way for moral relativism, that we continue to suffer the ill effects of, hence the need to resist the urge to spit. Jokingly, I wasn't seriously considering that. But my friend, Father Scott, told me this great story about, I've never been able to confirm whether it's true, but supposedly he did like to drink with his friends and play pool with his buddies, and after he was done doing his philosophy. His philosophy was really more of a game he played, and then he'd go play other games with his friends in the bar. But one night he fell into the ditch and he couldn't get up, and this old lady came by and recognized him, and he said, "Could you please help me up?" And she said, "You're that David Hume fellow." He said, "Well, yes, can you please help me up?" And she said, "Only if you deny all the stuff you've been saying in those little bookies of yours." and he said, "Okay." Let her help him up. He didn't take his ideas too seriously. The castle in Edinburgh was royally disappointing, I would say. We had high expectations, impressive building, but it's a museum for recent British war history, and the role that Scotland has played in that, which has been very prominent and very admirable. But we were hoping for a lot more of the medieval Scottish history, but that wasn't recorded at all there to speak of. But as we see here, the perfect site for a festival, and this was again being in the right place at the right time. I have talked many times how St. Anthony prays for me. It seems like whenever I travel. I heard about this, and I was able to get tickets while I was in Paris on the internet and find a place to pick them up in Edinburgh. The Military Tattoo is an annual festival they have at the castle in Edinburgh, and they get marching bands from all over the world that perform. So I got some video clips here I'll share with you to give you an idea of what that was like. And as with the Eiffel Tower of Paris, they use light projections on the castle for effect. These men were from Tonga. In China. Switzerland. And this was honoring the 150th anniversary for Robert Burns, the great Scottish poet. My favorite of the whole show, the top secret drumming corps from the Swiss Army. Best drumming you'll ever see. It's a good show when the RAF marching band is the most boring part. So then a week later, here I am in Jedburgh, and somebody from the parish says, "Oh, Father, I've got a ticket for you. They give away tickets. The tattoo comes right here." So they came to the tiny little town there. And Outdoors put on a show for us, and I think they were just free tickets, reserve in advance. Again, we're going to go long tonight, but there's just some great clips here that are worth looking at. Oops, if I can find them. In the light, you can see the individuals a lot better. First graders in the school love this. John Deere's in Scotland too. Notice the horses are in stilts. that song is a Scottish song. So if you're in Scotland, you do have to see castles for sure. They have plenty of those. Like I said, the Edinburgh Castle was a bit of a disappointment, overpriced and underwhelming in its tour, but we wound up buying an inclusive package, and that allowed me through the next week to go see all kinds of castles as part of it, so it worked out. But one very interesting site though, this chapel is across from where St. Margaret of Scotland passed away. Great queen who had a great influence on her husband Malcolm, apparently read him scripture every day, taught him how to pray, very dedicated to the poor, always fed the poor first before herself, and so on and so forth, like so many saintly monarchs, not so many, but like the saintly monarchs of history, truly impressive when they govern well. So one of the castles I went to see, Thrieve Castle, I really liked it. Much more medieval in its design rather than these modern ones that are more elaborate, simple and austere, but effective. Looking outside from it, you get a sense of what it was like. And this part was especially interesting. This is how they take care of the latrine and other such things. Washes out the side down the sluice there. So that's I always wondered how they did that. Now I know. This other castle is especially popular. I don't even know how to pronounce it. Caer Laverak. And a lot of people want to get married there and do get married there. It has that fairy tale feel to it. As long as you don't walk too far around, because you get to the other side, it didn't fare so well historically. Both of these castles, as I learned, were owned by the Maxwell family, a devout Catholic family, and during the 1600s, great religious struggles between the, whether with the English side or whether with the Presbyterian Scottish side, lying in ruins as an end result of those ugly years. I don't know all the history, or I would share more. I had to try to see, while I was there also, it's the time of year where they do the Highland Games. Most of them were on Sundays when I had masses, but I managed to find one that I could go to. My friend Father Scott said, "Oh, you went there." I think the word in the United States would be white trash, if I'm not mistaken. They were nice people. What are you talking about? But it was still fun to see these events in real life. Just brief footage. Of course, the caber toss. It's a lot harder than it looks, and it looks hard. Well, my Scottish friend, when he arrived home, took me for a tour one day of his stomping grounds at St. Andrews, of course famous now for the golf course that is there, but great history at St. Andrews, and he attended the University of St. Andrews for his undergraduate studies. And much more historically famous than for golf courses, it's called St. Andrews because of this shrine of St. Andrew, which for many centuries was the third most popular pilgrimage site in the world, second only to the tomb of Christ in Jerusalem, the Holy Sepulchre, and Santiago de Compostela in Spain, both of which are still famous pilgrimage sites. This one no longer has as many pilgrims. It's not in such good shape, as we'll hear more about. John Knox did that, and we'll see why he was so upset. But Scotsmen are quite adamant about the fact that this was the church, and as far as I know, it is the only church that claimed in the world to house the relics of St. Andrew the Apostle, that a Greek monk during some times of turmoil sailed, and for some reason all the way to Scotland, and that the relics of St. Andrew were housed there. They were thrown into the ocean in those turmoils with the establishment of Scottish Presbyterianism. For whatever reasons, you just get the impression, you don't want to have to talk to St. Andrew on Judgment Day. Why did you throw me into the ocean again? But it is what happened, and sad that this great holy site for so many centuries lies in ruins. But there are two sides to this story, as we'll see. It's not a simple one, and I don't pretend to know the ins and outs of the history of it. He took me to his university, and this is a very famous spot at St. Andrews University. Students never step on these ladders. It's considered very bad to do that, and they honor the site of the martyrdom of the Protestant Patrick Hamilton. Here it tells the story. The initials on the pavement nearby mark the spot where Patrick Hamilton, member of the university, was burned at the stake on February 29th, 1528, at the age of 24. On the continent, he had been greatly influenced by Martin Luther, and on his return to St. Andrews, he began to teach Lutheran doctrines. Having been tried and found guilty of heresy, he was condemned to death, thus becoming the first martyr of the Scottish Reformation. My friend Father Scott said, well, technically, he was already dead when they burnt him. Because he was joking, obviously, about that. But this was ugly on both sides. We'll talk more about respect for human dignity and freedom of conscience and freedom of religion again at the end. John Knox, the great Scottish reformer, founder of Scottish Presbyterianism, was not a happy man when he did finally come to power, as it were, and had the ability to return and do the reforms he had been wanting to do for some time. If you remember my Malta talk, you remember the descriptions of the galley slaves of this century, particularly in the Mediterranean, various European nations and Muslims, Turks, mutually enslaving each other to row each other's boats around as they fought each other. John Knox was forced to be a galley slave for 2 years, which didn't warm his heart towards Catholics, shall we say. And he vowed that when he finally got back to his pulpit, that he would establish and make things right. So my friend pointed out to me too the ruins of a fortress where he had been holed up, waiting for relief and reinforcements, holding out against the Catholics that he was literally, his side was fighting against. So when he finally did gain the upper hand, things weren't pretty. Father Scott showed me this, and many places around the town. You see statues here that were decapitated. All the religious images, and there's a lot of empty alcoves all over the place that used to have religious imagery that went against the Protestant theology of that century, and all removed in a very vindictive way. As I said, there's two sides to this very sad story, and plenty of atrocities on both sides that led this to happen. And church documents have said this repeatedly in the last several decades, reminding us it was wrong for these different reformers to break communion with the Catholic Church. That's always wrong. But at the same time, the sin that led to these divisions was on all sides. I mean, you can't just point the finger at the Protestant side. There were also many Catholics who sinned in a way that led to these sad divisions that we need to still work to heal. So my friend made me get up there and pretend that I was John Knox, and he took a picture of me in his pulpit there. Much more happy event here, and probably the highlight of the whole trip for me. I decided I really wanted to climb a mountain, which they call a Munro. I climbed two of them, actually. They have to be over 1,000 meters, which is about 3,200 feet, if I'm not mistaken. And this was a little trickier because, as I said, I was down in the borders of Scotland, down by Father Christmas's feet here. The Highlands, of course, are in the northern part here. Rather long drive, 5-6 hours, just to get to the southern Highlands. But I really wanted to make it work. And I was able to leave Sunday after the Masses and come back Monday night and make it work. I went through the guidebooks. I was trying to find a good mountain to climb, not too rugged, where I'd have to be doing actual, mountain climbing. I wanted something that I could hike up, but challenging. And I settled in the end not on the most popular one, but all around it were some of the most popular mountains that people climbed. And I thought, well, the view will be better on this mountain because I'll be able to, and I was right, look around and see all these other beautiful peaks. And on the way, of course, the famous Loch Ness is very long. It runs this whole, it's basically the dividing line between the Highlands and the rest of Scotland. A very long lake. I mean, of course, I didn't see the Loch Ness Monster while I was there. The interesting thing about this trip, the whole way there, it was raining. And I thought, this isn't going to work. And I really would like to do this hike and climb this mountain, but if it keeps raining like this, it's not going to be possible. But I kept thinking, no, St. Anthony, he always comes through for me. He's going to do it. Somehow, he's going to pull through and make this work. You've got to believe. So I pressed forward and held out hope. The next morning I got up, got to the foot of the mountain, and the top half of the mountain was covered with a cloud and with fog. It had at least stopped raining. I thought, well, I'll try climbing, and I can always turn around and come back if I reach a point where it becomes unsafe. And started climbing and made my way. About 45 minutes later, huffing and puffing a little bit. I wasn't in that great a shape then. But I thought, okay, I'm getting close to the top. And I finally come around the corner and I realize, oh, I'm not yet close to the top. And the top is still covered with fog. So I pressed forward with quite a ways still yet to go. Went past a hunting blind. They call it stalking deer there. So there are deer around there. This time, for real, I was getting close to the top, almost 2 hours after leaving the car, and eagerly made it up those final steps, and finally made it up, successfully climbed the mountain. And amazingly, the moment this, by the way, is at the top of each of these, this is what designates a Munro. They have these piles of rocks, and a lot of people, when they get there, take their own rock and add it to the collection, which I did. But the moment I got there, the sun came out. So and the whole time I was up on top, I had sunshine. So St. Anthony turns out, did come through. Spectacular, spectacular views. Totally worth it. I'll show you the video footage I took.
Here I am on top of the mountain. There's my bag. Far off in the distance there, you can see some of the mountains known as the Five Sisters. That little hill in the foreground, I climbed on the way up here. I thought I was at the top. Still had a long way to go. Down by that lake is where I started. Parked my car and climbed a couple hours ago. And here in a moment I'll be continuing along this ridge. To the second and third piece, you can see in the distance there. Then back down to my car. Amazing view.
Of course, our diocese does not look like that, but that's the Highlands in Scotland. Very beautiful, spectacular day. So I forged ahead. The farther peak there is another mountain, but this one was much easier because I was, basically just a little up and down and straight across, and I climbed another mountain. So it didn't take nearly as long. here I was getting closer. I could have taken this shortcut to the top, but definitely not a good idea. And this shortcut down, even less recommended. Definitely not a good idea. But I did make it up to the top of that mountain as well. I put a rock there as well. And there comes the sun again. While I was on top of that mountain. I had a spectacular view all around me. I'll show you just a few pictures of that from the different angles, just to get a sense of how breathtaking it was up there, especially when the sun came out and was able to look all around me into the highlands there. Then I started making my way down, and very easy, very quick, heading down. This is turning around and looking back up the hill. I was making great time back down to my car, and then saw even some of the, they call them red deer, down below. Managed to take a picture of them. Then ran into some mud issues down further. It had been raining after all, substantially the whole day, who knows how many days. And this is where I, started. I mean, it had dawned on me throughout the day, but it was sinking in, no pun intended, a little more, that, in some ways, this was a really stupid idea, foolish idea. I didn't see a single other human being the whole day. Didn't have a cell phone, and climbing all by myself there, but not the smartest thing I've ever done. Although I almost would say I would do it all over again if I had the chance, because it was a great day and a great sense of accomplishment. I only fell a few times on the way down, so muddy. I wound up losing my glasses without realizing it, but that all worked out, and I was very relieved when I finally saw the road. For the first time, the words of Captain Clark from the Lewis and Clark expedition came to mind. Road in view, oh the joy. He said ocean in view, oh the joy. And very relieved to make it to my car. I think I even remembered to go to the right-hand side and get in and drive. And it started raining a couple hours down the road and rained the whole way back. So I don't know why St. Anthony likes to pray for me that much, but I'll take it. He's always very generous. Well, moving on again to a more solemn, somber theme. In the borders themselves, I did go around touring these ruined abbeys as well as castles. And right there in Jedburgh, the town I was living in, this massive medieval abbey, I forget now if that was Augustinian or Cistercian, but obviously in ruins now. What happened was King Henry VIII confiscated these lands, I believe most of them in the 1540s. So after declaring himself supreme head of the Church in England, but in order to try to fuse England and Scotland together, Sir Walter Scott referred to this as the rough wooing of Scotland. But both before and after the Act of Supremacy, Henry confiscated lots of lands from the Catholic Church. This is why the Catholic Church, which survived the persecution in England, but very beaten up, is impoverished today and has very simple structures because all of their previous ones were taken from them and never given back. So, and they became, because they are built in more defensible positions in case the monks ever got attacked, they became militarily strategic points, suffered damage in cases, and then with Scottish Presbyterianism taking off, were never to be rebuilt. And so they lie in ruins to this day. It's very beautiful, edifying to see these amazing structures, beautiful architecture, but so saddening and pondering how great things once were there. This was a troubling image there in the Jedburgh Abbey. They had on display, I'm not sure if this was the Church of England or the Presbyterians, but it's the four Gospels stoning the Pope. So you have Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and I think on the rock it says, it says their names, but the idea is with the truth of the Gospel, they're taking care of this awful office that is the papacy, and underneath the Pope you see these two other figures that are personifications of pride and avarice, and he's feebly trying to reach for something to defend himself, but he can't defend himself against the truth of the gospel. That's the idea of this imagery. It gives you a sense for the polemics of the time period. I already showed you some of Kelso Abbey, my other parish that I was helping with there, and Dryborough Abbey, I imagine that's how it's pronounced, a very big, famous one nearby. I loved this door, very beautiful entrance into the abbey there, but lying in ruins. And I was very struck, this caught my attention immediately, this little description of the abbey, this part here, founded in about 1150 by Hugh de Morville. And knowing that piece of English history, I thought, wait a minute, Hugh de Morville is one of the 4 knights who martyred St. Thomas Becket on December 29th, 1170. I knew the year, I just knew this from my medieval Latin class and from teaching about it to my own Latin students over the years. He was one of the 4 knights in 1170, but he was obviously, a devout Catholic, a practicing Catholic who was willing to endow monasteries and get them started. And all 4 of those knights did, together with King Henry II, do penance following that martyrdom of Becket. This is an interesting little story, and I'm already well over time, but we'll finish eventually. Leave when you like. St. Thomas Becket, martyred by these 4 knights, and there actually was a 5th person involved. Reginald Fitzurse, William de Tracy, Hugh de Morville, and Richard Brito, I believe, were their 4 names. I met a priest once from Maine named Father Tracy. His last name, T-R-A-C-I, and he is a direct descendant of Sir William de Tracy, one of the 4 who martyred St. Thomas Becket. But one of his great-great-great-great-grandchildren is now a Catholic priest. He was at Canterbury, where Becket was martyred, and wanted to offer Mass. He met another Catholic priest who was a direct descendant of Hugh de Morville. And the 2 of them, both direct descendants, both Catholic priests, and together they offered Mass at Canterbury for the conversion of England. Very interesting little story, I thought. How history works itself out. And we'll continue to pray for that, because there are so many sad things still, and a lack of vibrancy in Catholic faith in Scotland and England today compared to us here in the States. So this abbey also contains the tomb for Sir Walter Scott, so stop there and said a prayer for him. And probably the most elegant abbey in the area, Melrose Abbey. And it's famous for other reasons, because it has the heart of Robert the Bruce, for you Braveheart aficionados, who might not realize that Braveheart is actually not referring to William Wallace, but referring to Robert the Bruce. He learned to be a Braveheart from the inspiration he got from William Wallace. And this is a recurring theme, if you haven't noticed by now, not just this evening, but in all these talks, that freedom, and to mention Braveheart, freedom of conscience, freedom of religion, keep coming up in these historic, and we can learn a lot from these historical events that is very relevant for today's discussions. And we've gone over this quote before in these other sessions. Such an important quote from the Second Vatican Council, where the bishops addressed religious freedom, that this freedom means all men are to be immune from coercion on the part of individuals or of social groups and of any human power in such wise that no one is to be forced to act in a manner contrary to his own beliefs, whether privately or publicly, whether alone or in association with others, within due limits. So it's not just religion is not just a private affair. There is a right to practice our faith publicly, and no one, Catholic or otherwise, should be forced to violate his or her conscience, his or her religious convictions, because to do so is a sin. We don't want to force others to this, as we've seen that in a moment. Just as some St. Thomas Becket himself was struggling for religious freedom. He was upset that that one of the king's men had put on trial one of his own priests. and took matters into his own hands rather than letting it go through the church courts. Of course, that division no longer exists in the same form today. But St. John Fisher and St. Thomas More, we heard about, put to death under Henry VIII for refusing to violate their consciences, being forced against their conscience. Both Mary I on the Catholic side in England and Elizabeth I on the Protestant side, or I should say the Anglican side, but they both savagely tortured and killed those who did not agree with them. It's ironic, therefore, that they're both in the same tomb together until Jesus comes again. And, there couldn't be two more monarchs in English history, but in another sense, both of them failed in a serious way to respect human dignity and religious freedom. In Scotland, all those confiscated abbeys and monasteries and all the difficult things I talked about with John Knox and with the Scottish Reformation, again with atrocities on both sides. Ugly histories, but on all sides they're not always a respect of religious freedom and freedom of conscience. Going back much more early church and those persecutions, trying to Christians in the empire to violate their consciences and worship. In Mexico, 100 years ago, very serious persecution of the church I encourage you to learn more about. First with the confiscation of church property, and eventually martyring priests as well. Found again. And right now, in the news this week, we have two very contemporary examples that follow exactly the same themes. I was just reading about this in a newspaper today. The Amish right here in our own county being evicted from their homes because they believe it's against their conscience to put in battery-powered smoke alarms and carbon dioxide alarms in their homes. It's technically against the laws that are on the books, but forcing them to violate their conscience in their own homes quite obviously is against the First Amendment. We'll see why. I mean, this is well religious freedom. Their religious freedom in this case. On the Catholic side, the Little Sisters of the Poor, who I have been to their places multiple times. Beautiful sisters who are with the dying in their final moments. They provide hospice care for those late in life. And it's so beautiful because when they get to the final hours, the sisters take turns. The person is never alone. And they pray and keep vigil with the person to the end. All they do is dying, asking nothing in return. And the present administration, as of January 1st, forcing them to violate their conscience by providing contraceptives, sterilizations, and drugs that cause early abortions. And while the argument is they don't pay for it themselves, they sign a form that authorizes someone else to pay for it. And the proponents of the mandate say it's just a piece of paper. Well, of course, I mean, with St. Thomas More, too. Parliament just sign the Act of Supremacy. It's just a piece of paper. There's so many things that are just a piece of paper. Your marriage license was just a piece of paper, those of you who are married. Pieces of paper sometimes matter. And obviously it's so blatantly unjust to step in and force these poor sisters to violate their conscience. Thankfully, the Supreme Court, Justice Sotomayor did, for now, there is a stay. This is not going to be enforced on them yet, but that is pending. So please pray for them. And we'll see how all these religious freedom issues get resolved. They're still pending. We can consider these principles, which I considered last year in the talk on religious freedom. These are three bedrock principles, I think, that it's so important to honor the freedom of others, to follow their religious convictions publicly and privately, to follow their conscience within due limits, and I would suggest these are the due limits, the common good. If someone in the name of religion or in the name of conscience begins violating the common good, then the government does have a right to step in and sometimes should step in. Likewise, objective truth matters here. If the religion is deviating from ethics or things that are knowable to our own reason, or deviating from sound science, then there's more ground for the state to step in. But in the case of the Amish, there's clearly no deviation significantly from these principles that would warrant violating their conscience. They should, by the First Amendment, be protected. So these are important principles to keep in mind and promote in our public discourse today, and we learn a lot from the history. One final stop here to show you. I drove one day across the border into England at the urging of a parishioner, visited what's called Holy Island, another ruined abbey. On this island, like Mont Saint-Michel in France, it's a tidal island. But this one, actually, there is danger. At some point, the road is covered over with the tide, and then you have to drive when it's low enough. So I was able to figure out what time to drive over, make sure I got back off. I didn't want to get stuck on the island for the whole tide because I was pressed for time. But I did get a brief visit. Sense of sadness. Another ruined abbey. First, it was trashed by those evil Vikings that came in and invaded it. And then, but they rebuilt, but then, as with those others, confiscated by Henry VIII, and then eventually a military fortress built there, becomes a very strategic military location, and then gets destroyed and never rebuilt. Especially sad in this case, though, because Holy Island and Lindisfarne Abbey was a hub. Most of England was evangelized from that island, and now that lies in ruins. And we don't realize this, but actually from England and from Ireland, so much of modern-day Europe was evangelized by the missionaries that sailed out from England, from Ireland, to evangelize those barbarian tribes that had, run all over Europe, and the Vikings as well. And they were all eventually Christianized, especially by English and Irish monasteries. And the new evangelization by all three of our pontiffs here, and actually Paul VI was the first person to use the term, and all of them very serious about it, including evangelizing our culture, helping those who live in these Christian parts of the world, who are baptized, who in theory are disciples of Jesus, but in practice have never really met Jesus Christ, have never really encountered him personally, and helping transform personally and renew Christians personally, and helping renew our culture. Great tasks we have. I would suggest what we learn from another great pope, one of my very favorites, Gregory the Great, who was so talented, who just wanted to be a monk and live in peace and pray, but was too talented and was forced basically to, he said yes, but to be pope. He was such a good administrator too, and really helped the city of Rome get back on its feet. It had been in terrible shape, and helped save civilization all around him, because there was nobody else to really step forward and do it. And along the way sent out so many missionaries, and built and established many Benedictine monasteries. He was a Benedictine monk himself. And this is not something that we modern people think of, but our faith and our culture clearly is in growing crisis. We are facing difficult times. It is not easy to be Catholic today. I'm not going against anything Pope Francis has been saying. Yes, we need to be positive in our message to the culture, but we can be as positive as we want. The culture is not necessarily going to be positive back to us, and we have to be prepared for that response. And Gregory's response is religious life. And it's the long response that we don't think of. He establishes these monasteries. In the short term, what good does that do for starving people and for decaying, crumbling civilization? And it did continue to crumble, and it did fall badly. And the subsequent 400 years after his death were mostly times of trial in Europe. But he planted the seeds, which eventually evangelized all of Europe, civilized all these barbarians, taught them how to respect each other and treat each other with decency, and laid all the foundations for modern law and democracy. We never give that credit to the monks, but that is really where it came from. Most of the benefits of modern civilization were started with Gregory's efforts of founding monasteries. And so we need to pray more than ever for a renewal of religious life and for many vocations to religious life. And the witness of religious will in turn help transform our culture in the new evangelization. Thank you. I hope to see you next time.